The summer of 1944 in Belarusia seemed deceptively quiet. Army Group Center, stretched thin across hundreds of miles of forest, swamp, and river, had not expected a major Soviet offensive in this sector. The generals, confident in the years of training and combat experience of their best divisions, believed they held a relatively secure front. Veteran formations like the 78th Storm Division, the 6th Luftwaffe Field Division, and several seasoned infantry units were deployed strategically, considered reliable enough to withstand any probing attacks. These were not raw recruits, but soldiers hardened by years of bitter fighting on the Eastern Front. The commanders' maps were marked with familiar symbols, each representing a unit they trusted, a piece of their professional army that could execute precise maneuvers under pressure. Yet behind this apparent calm, there were warning signs that went largely unnoticed. Intelligence reports hinted at unusual Soviet troop movements, massive logistical preparations, and concentrations of artillery and armor. But Army Group Center assumed these were diversions or routine exercises. The staffs, busy managing day-to-day logistics and tactical patrols, failed to grasp the scale of what was gathering across the forests to the east. Morale was cautiously high among the troops. Letters from home, periodic supplies, and occasional rotation of units created a sense of normalcy. Generals discussed strategy in quiet confidence, drawing contingency plans on their maps, unaware that the enemy had already begun assembling the largest force the Wehrmacht would face in years. Within the headquarters, officers moved between rooms, consulting maps and charts, marking distances and defensive sectors. They assumed that their veterans, trained in years of disciplined warfare, could repel any assault, buy time, and even counterattack if necessary. On the front lines, soldiers maintained their trenches and bunkers, inspecting weapons, performing drills, and preparing for the possibility of minor engagements. Few could imagine the storm approaching. The Soviets had been planning for months, amassing hundreds of thousands of men, thousands of tanks and artillery pieces in carefully hidden positions. Their intelligence on German dispositions was accurate and thorough, and they had identified the most critical units whose destruction would shatter the cohesion of Army Group Center. Meanwhile, the German generals, comfortable in their routines and reassured by prior defensive successes, failed to anticipate that their so-called quiet sector was about to become the epicenter of catastrophe. Orders circulated as usual, emphasizing standard patrols, maintenance, and minor tactical movements. Yet these orders could not prepare the divisions for the unprecedented onslaught that would follow. By July 1944, these veteran units, experienced in prior Soviet offensives and adept at tactical withdrawals, were still seen as the backbone of German resistance. Commanders took pride in their discipline, their ability to hold positions against repeated Soviet attacks, and their skill in conducting organized retreats when necessary. They trusted these soldiers not only to defend territory, but to provide stability in the overall strategic picture. What the generals did not foresee was that the Soviet offensive would bypass minor skirmishes and strike directly at the heart of Army Group Center's combat power. In quiet meetings, commanders discussed reinforcements, rationing, and rotation schedules, completely unaware that within days, these veteran formations would face encirclement, overwhelming firepower, and the destruction of their cohesion. Soldiers carried out drills with a sense of routine, cleaning rifles, checking artillery emplacements, and rehearsing defensive positions. The forests and rivers that had offered some natural defense would soon become traps, channeled into killing zones by a meticulously planned Soviet operation. The stage was set, not with dramatic warnings, but with the deceptive calm of a front that had grown accustomed to minor assaults and static warfare. Veterans felt confident, younger soldiers eager to prove themselves, and officers proud of the professionalism their units displayed. Yet this confidence was built on assumptions that ignored the massive Soviet buildup in the shadows. In those final days before the offensive, the German staff believed they were ready for any challenge, but in reality, the foundations of Army Group Center's strength were about to be tested in a way that no prior engagement had prepared them for. Every map, every tactical calculation, and every command decision would soon be rendered obsolete as the Soviets initiated an operation designed not merely to defeat, but to annihilate the very units upon which the German army's reputation and strategic stability depended.
By the opening days of July 1944, the Soviets launched an offensive that would reshape the Eastern Front forever. Operation Bagration began not with fanfare, but with the sudden roar of artillery, thousands of guns firing in unison across Belarusian forests and river valleys. The Germans, still believing in the relative calm of their sector, were caught off guard by the sheer scale and coordination of the assault. The front lines, manned by the most experienced troops in Army Group Center, faced an onslaught that was meticulously planned to destroy their ability to resist. Within hours, entire sectors were overrun. Soviet forces executed deep penetrations surrounding German units and severing their supply lines. What had been considered a defensive bulwark became a deadly trap. The 78th Sturm Division, seasoned in prior campaigns, found itself cut off from neighboring units. Communication lines failed under the weight of Soviet artillery barrages and air attacks, leaving commanders in isolation, forced to make desperate last-minute decisions. Tanks, thought secure behind forested ridges, were destroyed in ambushes, crushed under concentrated fire from multiple directions. The 6th Luftwaffe Field Division, positioned to hold a key junction, faced encirclement within the first 24 hours. Officers watched in disbelief as entire battalions vanished from their maps. Divisions that had withstood earlier Soviet offensives, that had conducted orderly withdrawals in 1941 and 1943, now struggled to maintain coherence. On the front, soldiers experienced a combination of shock and disbelief. Experienced infantrymen who had faced the Red Army in countless engagements were overwhelmed by the speed and ferocity of the attack. Supply depots were abandoned under fire, artillery pieces left to be captured or destroyed. Tank units attempted counterattacks, but Soviet anti-tank guns, coordinated with infantry and air support, halted each effort, inflicting massive losses. In Army Group Center headquarters, staff officers frantically updated situation maps. Each crossed-out division symbol was not a tactical setback, but a sign that the formation had ceased to exist as a fighting entity. Communications from field units were sporadic, often ending abruptly, leaving generals and their aides to imagine the worst. Orders were drafted and redrafted, attempting to plug gaps that had already become chasms. Reinforcements were sent, but the Soviets had already anticipated these movements, creating traps and ambushes that multiplied German losses. Within days, it became clear that the offensive was not a conventional attack, but a carefully orchestrated destruction of the Wehrmacht's core. The scale was unprecedented. Over 2,000 tanks were lost within the first week. Thousands of artillery pieces, painstakingly moved and positioned over months, were abandoned, destroyed, or captured. The men of Army Group Center, once proud of their veteran status and ability to respond to Soviet offensives, now faced a relentless and organized force that left little room for maneuver. Generals like Jordan observed in horror as the formations they had relied upon, the units they had considered secure, were systematically encircled. Retreats that had once been executed with discipline turned into desperate withdrawals, often collapsing under the weight of Soviet pressure. Soldiers found themselves isolated in forests, swamps, and villages, cut off from command and without supplies. In some sectors, entire regiments surrendered en masse, knowing that survival depended on giving up rather than continuing hopeless resistance. The speed of the offensive left little time for German staff to react. Maps that had been updated daily now seemed obsolete within hours. Division after division disappeared from reports. Radio transmissions, once filled with detailed updates and tactical requests, became fragmented, incoherent, or silent. The Soviets exploited this chaos with relentless efficiency. Air support targeted retreating columns, while mechanized units cut off escape routes and created pockets of encirclement. The Germans, trained to adapt to battlefield shifts, now were reacting to movements that had been pre-planned weeks in advance by their adversary. Panic, while controlled in some units, spread quietly through others. Soldiers who had trusted their training and leadership found themselves unsure whom to follow or where to regroup. Senior officers attempted to organize counterattacks, but without coherent communication, these efforts often led into ambushes, causing further casualties. Meanwhile, the human cost mounted. Within 3 weeks, nearly 300,000 German soldiers would be killed, wounded, or captured across Belarusia. Entire divisions that had represented years of experience and rigorous training ceased to exist, leaving the army with a void that could not be filled. By the end of the first phase of Operation Bagration, the German command confronted a terrifying reality. The offensive was not simply pushing them back, it was systematically destroying the professional core of their army. Units that had been expected to form the backbone of resistance were no longer available to hold lines or execute maneuvers. The generals, watching from headquarters, understood that conventional tactics would no longer suffice. The enemy had already dictated the terms of battle. In villages and forests, small pockets of German soldiers tried to regroup, but the scale of the Soviet advance rendered these efforts isolated and temporary. Those who survived the initial encirclements would face further engagements under extreme disadvantage. What had started as a quiet sector, considered secure by months of experience and careful positioning, had become a nightmare of strategic collapse. Each passing day brought more divisions lost, more artillery abandoned, and more troops forced to surrender. The Soviet plan was executing perfectly, exploiting weaknesses and neutralizing Germany's strongest formations. For the generals and soldiers of Army Group Center, there was a growing awareness that the war on the Eastern Front had shifted irreversibly. The balance of power, once assumed to favor the defenders, had been shattered in a matter of days. The shock was not just in numbers, tanks, or artillery, but in the realization that their elite forces, the units they had relied upon for years, could be destroyed so quickly. The stage was set for the next phase of annihilation, as the Germans struggled to comprehend the scale of devastation and what it meant for the future of their army and the broader war effort.
By mid-July 1944, the true horror of Operation Bagration became impossible to ignore. The Soviet offensive, launched with precise coordination and overwhelming force, was not merely pushing German units back, it was annihilating them. Divisions that had once been the pride of the Wehrmacht were now being erased from the maps, their names crossed out in Army Group Center headquarters as though they had never existed. The 78th Sturm Division, seasoned through countless engagements and known for its discipline, found itself encircled in the dense forests of Belarusia. Supply lines were severed, reinforcements blocked, and the division's command structure disintegrated under relentless artillery and air bombardment. Soldiers, trained to respond to tactical setbacks, now faced a catastrophe beyond anything they had imagined. Their cohesion broke as pockets of troops were cut off from one another, forced into isolated skirmishes that could not influence the larger battle. The 6th Luftwaffe Field Division, similarly seasoned, was assigned to hold a critical junction near the Dnieper tributaries. Initially, the unit tried to mount a defensive line, relying on entrenched positions and local knowledge of the terrain, but Soviet mechanized units and infantry spearheads penetrated their flanks, bypassing the main defensive points and creating encirclements that trapped entire regiments. Officers sent desperate requests for artillery support and reinforcements, but these never arrived. The Soviets had anticipated each movement, using reconnaissance to predict counterattacks and artillery strikes to eliminate any organized response. Across the sector, other veteran infantry divisions faced the same fate. Units that had been tested repeatedly on the Eastern Front, surviving the brutal winters of 1942, the battles for Smolensk and Zhev, and countless defensive withdrawals, now faced a force so vast that traditional defensive tactics were useless. Entire battalions vanished under bombardment, their positions overrun, their soldiers killed, captured, or scattered. Generals in Army Group Center watched in disbelief as situation maps, once filled with familiar division symbols, began to empty. Each crossed-out unit represented not just lost territory, but a professional fighting force destroyed. The human cost was staggering. By this stage of the offensive, hundreds of thousands of men had been killed, wounded, or captured. Commanders could only estimate the scale, as field reports became increasingly fragmented and often ended abruptly. Soldiers who had once been confident in their training and experience now struggled to survive. Encircled units attempted desperate breakout operations. Some small groups managed to slip through Soviet lines, but these were exceptions. Many were captured or killed during night movements, ambushes, or artillery barrages. The Soviets had learned from prior campaigns. They coordinated infantry, armor, and artillery with precision, leaving no safe avenues for retreat. Tanks, once considered the backbone of German mobile defense, were destroyed en masse. Anti-tank ambushes, combined with artillery and air attacks, neutralized the mechanized counterattacks that the German generals had hoped would stabilize their lines. Artillery units, meant to support infantry and hold key positions, were often abandoned when mobility was lost, either destroyed to prevent capture or seized by advancing Soviet forces. Each loss compounded the next. Morale plummeted. Officers who had survived years of Eastern Front combat faced a realization they could not ignore. Their best troops, the soldiers who had defined the Wehrmacht's reputation, were being systematically erased. In some sectors, entire regiments ceased to exist. In others, remnants tried to form defensive pockets, only to be encircled and overwhelmed. The scale of destruction exceeded even the catastrophic losses of Stalingrad. There, urban fighting had caused massive casualties, but units could eventually be reconstituted. Here, the loss of formations represented years of accumulated experience and training, something impossible to rebuild in a short period. As the weeks passed, the German generals' understanding shifted from disbelief to horror. The destruction was not random, it was carefully planned, executed, and relentless. Each Soviet advance cut deeper into the heart of Army Group Center, targeting veteran divisions with precision. The sense of invincibility that German soldiers and commanders had carried through prior engagements evaporated. For the first time, there was a widespread realization that some units would never return to the field. Communications deteriorated. Reports of surviving pockets of resistance reached headquarters sporadically, often delayed by hours or days. Commanders attempted to coordinate counterattacks, but by then entire divisions were gone, leaving gaps in the defensive line that could not be filled. Soldiers on the ground described a landscape transformed into chaos. Villages burned, forests shelled, and fields crisscrossed with craters from artillery. The noise of battle was continuous, punctuated by the roar of Soviet tanks and aircraft overhead. Exhausted, hungry, and demoralized, German soldiers struggled to hold positions that had already been predetermined as untenable by the scale of the offensive. Generals tried to regroup what was left, moving surviving troops into defensive lines, but these efforts were largely symbolic. The elite divisions, the ones meant to form the backbone of resistance, were no longer available to form coherent fighting units. The Soviets exploited this vacuum, pushing deeper and widening encirclements to ensure no counterattack could succeed. The speed and precision of destruction shocked even the most hardened officers. Where in previous campaigns retreat could be orderly, now withdrawal meant abandoning equipment, leaving wounded behind, and often facing immediate engagement with overwhelming Soviet forces. The Wehrmacht's tactical flexibility, which had allowed survival in prior disasters, was rendered useless.
Within 3 weeks, 28 divisions had been destroyed or rendered combat ineffective, 2,000 tanks lost, artillery in the thousands abandoned or captured, and 300,000 soldiers killed or taken prisoner. The loss was not merely numerical, it represented the annihilation of the professional core of the German army in the East. In headquarters, generals like Jordan documented the collapse, noting the names of divisions that had been elite just days before. They watched as symbols on the map disappeared one by one, each a silent testimony to the irreversible destruction of Germany's most experienced formations. The sense of shock was compounded by the realization that recovery would be impossible. Unlike previous setbacks, where replacements and reorganization could restore combat effectiveness, these losses represented years of training, experience, and cohesion that could never be recreated. For the soldiers, the generals, and the staff, the weeks of mid-July marked a turning point. Army Group Center was no longer a coordinated fighting force. It was a collection of scattered units, desperate pockets of resistance, and a command struggling to react to a disaster of unprecedented scale. The destruction of the elite formations had not only opened gaps in the line, it had shattered the Wehrmacht's ability to resist effectively, leaving the Soviet forces free to continue their advance with momentum that would carry deep into German-held territory.
By late July 1944, the collapse of Army Group Center had become undeniable. What had started as a seemingly manageable crisis had transformed into a nightmare of command paralysis, shattered lines, and overwhelming Soviet momentum. The once proud divisions, those elite formations that had survived years of brutal combat on the Eastern Front, were now scattered remnants, incapable of coordinated action. In headquarters, generals and staff officers moved from map room to map room, their faces drawn with disbelief. Reports arrived sporadically, often fragmented or contradictory. Units listed as engaged were later reported destroyed or encircled, leaving commanders grasping at the remains of a front that no longer existed. The speed of the Soviet advance had rendered standard tactical responses obsolete. Reinforcements sent to plug gaps were cut off before reaching their objectives. Supply convoys disappeared into ambushes, their drivers and escorting troops captured or killed. Artillery positions abandoned under pressure left infantry without fire support, and mechanized units, intended as mobile reserves, were reduced to small, isolated groups incapable of altering the outcome. The psychological impact on the German high command was profound. Generals who had spent years orchestrating complex operations were forced to confront a reality in which their most reliable troops had vanished almost overnight. The maps, once a source of clarity and control, now displayed only empty squares and crossed-out symbols, each representing a division lost in its entirety. Morale among surviving officers and troops eroded rapidly. Soldiers who had trained for months, drilled in defensive maneuvers, and fought in countless prior engagements found themselves in chaotic situations with no clear orders. Retreats, when attempted, often led into well-prepared Soviet encirclements. Panic, though contained in some sectors, spread quietly among units already weakened by fatigue, loss of comrades, and the relentless pressure of the offensive. Attempts to organize counterattacks were mostly symbolic. Where the Wehrmacht had once relied on disciplined, professional formations to mount effective responses, they now had only small, fragmented groups, often lacking coordination and communication. The Soviets exploited every weakness. Mechanized spearheads cut deep into rear areas, isolating command posts and severing lines of communication. Artillery barrages prevented regrouping, while air attacks targeted retreating columns, ensuring that even the survivors faced continuous attrition. In towns and villages, desperate German units tried to establish defensive positions. Barricades were erected, machine guns manned, and small counterattacks launched, yet each effort was met with overwhelming force. Soviet infantry, supported by tanks and artillery, systematically dismantled these pockets of resistance.
The sense of inevitability grew as each day passed. Staff officers at Army Group Center realized that they could no longer rely on the principles of mobile defense or tactical withdrawals that had served them in previous campaigns. The battlefield had changed in scale and intensity, and the Army's best divisions, the units meant to stabilize the front, were gone. The logistical collapse compounded the operational crisis. Food, ammunition, and medical supplies failed to reach frontline units. Horses, trucks, and armored vehicles abandoned during retreats fell into enemy hands. Communication lines were repeatedly destroyed or intercepted, leaving commanders isolated and forcing them to make decisions with incomplete information. The cumulative effect of these failures was catastrophic. Within days, the Germans were no longer conducting a coordinated defense. They were reacting to the Soviet offensive in a series of desperate, localized engagements. Every tactical decision was constrained by the absence of reliable forces and the constant threat of encirclement. Generals like Jordan, observing the destruction, noted that even units with strong leadership and experienced soldiers could not withstand the pressure. What remained of Army Group Center was a patchwork of combatants attempting to hold ground, often unaware of neighboring units' status or intentions. The psychological strain on commanders and soldiers alike was immense. Letters from field officers conveyed fear and uncertainty. Morale, once maintained through pride in training and cohesion, disintegrated under the relentless pace of Soviet advances. Desertions, while not widespread, began to appear among those who saw no prospect of organized resistance or survival. The speed and precision of the Soviet operation ensured that there would be no opportunity for the Germans to regroup. Each breakthrough widened gaps, forcing remaining troops into untenable positions and further stretching command capabilities. The chain of command itself began to falter. Orders issued from headquarters were often outdated by the time they reached units. Subordinate commanders, cut off or misinformed, made independent decisions that sometimes conflicted with broader strategic objectives. Coordination became impossible, and the semblance of a unified front evaporated. Within 3 weeks, the operational reality was clear. Army Group Center could no longer function as a cohesive fighting force. The loss of elite divisions, the destruction of supply lines, and the collapse of communication networks meant that even competent units could not operate effectively. Small pockets of resistance were isolated and eventually overwhelmed. The commanders faced a choice between attempting futile counterattacks or organizing retreats that would save what little remained. Retreat, however, offered no guarantee of survival. The Soviets controlled the initiative, dictating the pace and location of engagements. Columns moving through forests and river valleys were subjected to artillery strikes and ambushes, further eroding manpower and equipment. By the end of this phase, the once feared Army Group Center was effectively neutralized. Its former strength, built on years of training, battlefield experience, and disciplined command, had been shattered. The Germans could no longer hold the line, counterattack effectively, or even maintain coherent defensive positions. The collapse demonstrated not only the overwhelming effectiveness of Soviet operational planning, but also the fragility of a military force when elite units, the backbone of its capability, are systematically destroyed. The implications were profound. The destruction of Army Group Center opened the door to further Soviet advances into German-held territory, altering the strategic balance on the Eastern Front. For the soldiers and commanders who survived, the weeks of July 1944 became a period of confusion, fear, and relentless attrition, marking the beginning of the end for German resistance in Belarusia. The collapse of the command structure, the loss of veteran formations, and the relentless pressure of the Soviet offensive combined to ensure that Army Group Center could never recover its former strength. The stage was set for the final phase, where the consequences of this annihilation would reverberate across the Eastern Front, shaping the trajectory of the war in ways the Germans could neither control nor reverse.
By early August 1944, the scale of destruction left by Operation Bagration was fully apparent. Army Group Center, once considered one of the Wehrmacht's most formidable formations, had been shattered beyond repair. Entire divisions that had represented years of combat experience and training were gone. Over 28 divisions had been destroyed or rendered combat ineffective, leaving gaps across hundreds of kilometers of front. The German High Command faced an uncomfortable truth. The professional core of their army in the East no longer existed. Supplies, equipment, and infrastructure had been abandoned or captured. Thousands of artillery pieces, armored vehicles, and trucks had fallen into Soviet hands. The losses were staggering, exceeding even those of Stalingrad, but with a crucial difference. The formations lost were not hastily trained units, but elite, veteran divisions whose absence could never be replaced. For the surviving soldiers, the aftermath was a mixture of exhaustion, disillusionment, and despair. Units that had survived encirclement and retreat found themselves constantly on the move, attempting to establish defensive positions that were already obsolete. Morale was low, and the sense of inevitability hung over every action. Commanders, from battalion leaders to generals, struggled to coordinate what remained of their forces, often sending reinforcements to areas that no longer existed as coherent sectors. Strategically, the consequences of Bagration were profound. The Soviet summer offensive had not only destroyed the best German formations in Belarusia, but also opened a corridor for continued advances into Poland, Lithuania, and the heart of Eastern Europe. The initiative on the Eastern Front had irrevocably shifted. Where the Germans had once dictated the pace of operations, they were now forced into reactive, defensive maneuvers, scrambling to respond to a rapidly changing battlefield. Historians later would describe Operation Bagration as one of the most successful offensives of the entire war. Its combination of deception, coordination, and overwhelming force had achieved what few military planners believed possible: the systematic annihilation of an entire army group's elite forces. For the Wehrmacht, this represented a turning point. Without the professional backbone of Army Group Center, the ability to mount large-scale, coordinated counterattacks evaporated. The Eastern Front, once a line of disciplined resistance, became a series of fragmented engagements where improvisation and survival replaced strategy and control. The human cost was immense. More than 300,000 German soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. Many of those captured would spend the remainder of the war in Soviet prison camps, while countless others perished in combat or from exhaustion and deprivation during retreats. Families back in Germany, unaware of the full scale of the losses, received only fragments of the truth, often in official communiques that understated the disaster. On the Soviet side, Operation Bagration marked a triumph of planning and execution. Commanders coordinated millions of men, thousands of tanks and artillery with precision. They exploited intelligence, terrain, and timing to ensure the maximum effect, demonstrating an operational skill that would define the Red Army's late-war capabilities. The victory also had a psychological impact. The Wehrmacht, long considered invincible in the East, had suffered a defeat so complete that the myth of German invulnerability was shattered. Soldiers and officers alike recognized that the strategic initiative had shifted permanently. In the aftermath, the Wehrmacht attempted to stabilize the front, but without the elite divisions that had been destroyed, these efforts were largely defensive and reactive. New units, hastily trained and poorly equipped, could not replace the experience and cohesion lost in July 1944. The repercussions extended beyond immediate military consequences. Politically and psychologically, the destruction of Army Group Center weakened Germany's ability to influence operations on other fronts. It emboldened the Allies and contributed to the acceleration of the war's endgame.
Military planners in both the East and the West recognized that the Wehrmacht could no longer conduct coordinated, large-scale operations with the same effectiveness it had displayed in prior years. For the surviving German soldiers, the experience left an indelible mark. Many carried memories of encirclement, artillery bombardments, and the collapse of units they had trusted and fought alongside. Letters, diaries, and later testimonies reveal the profound sense of loss and disbelief at how quickly formations that had once seemed invincible could be destroyed. Operation Bagration, in historical perspective, stands as a testament to the devastating consequences of strategic misjudgment and the effectiveness of coordinated offensive operations. It was not only a tactical victory for the Soviets, but also a decisive blow that reshaped the trajectory of the Eastern Front. The loss of veteran divisions permanently altered the Wehrmacht's capabilities, setting the stage for continued Soviet advances and the eventual push into German territory. In the years following the war, military historians studied Bagration as a case study in operational art, logistics, and deception. The lessons were clear. An army, no matter how experienced or disciplined, is vulnerable if intelligence is ignored, reserves are inadequate, and command underestimates the scale and coordination of the enemy. For Germany, the summer of 1944 in Belarusia marked the beginning of a retreat from which it would never recover strategically on the Eastern Front. The destruction of Army Group Center was not simply a loss of territory, it was the irreversible collapse of the professional army that had once been the backbone of German military power. Its lessons, painful and costly, reverberated far beyond the battlefield, shaping the final chapters of World War II.